Words. So I'm your host, Rabbi Zevi Weinberg, and we're going to be joined soon by an extraordinary scholar. His name is Rabbi Yossi Banishevitz, one of the great geniuses, actually, of our time, an expert in the field of Jewish mysticism and Hasidus. And we are really, really excited and honored to have him with us on Soul Talk. But just in the next couple of minutes until he comes on, I want to share with you something that I studied today, a very, very fascinating subject. And that is that we all know that there are 10 spheres. The 10 spheres, if you want to call them, are categories. So at the essence of life is what? Life. I remember asking my wonderful, precocious, beautiful daughter, Estelea, once when she was young. I'm a big philosopher. She's a very practical person. I said, Estelea, what's the meaning of life? So she goes, living. So it never occurred to me that living is the meaning of life. But the truth is, of course, that is the basis and foundation of everything, living, life itself. And life itself is an energy. It's actually what the soul is basically part of God. My father told me from Jewish mysticism recently, a fascinating thing. I'm not going to go into all of it, but one of the definitions of God, it's the hardest thing in the world to define as God, is life. He exists. He is alive. Um, the other definition is Yehoilis, is he has infinite ability. So he exists and he has infinite ability. Now, ability itself is not a defined thing. It's like, say I'm an artist. So I have an infinite ability to draw anything. Now, even that is already a definition. It's a definition of art. But with God, it's infinite. It's in anything possible, even mutually exclusive things, anything. But that's a separate subject. The main point that I want to bring out is that number one, we have life. But the question is, where does that life go through? A good example of this is light. Light basically can almost become infinite colors. But what color will it be? So it very much depends on the container. We know that all colors are actually, what they do is it absorbs light and it only radiates one frequency of light. So all light basically contains all colors. And yet what it happens is when it strikes, let's say something that's green, everything but the green frequency has been emitted, is absorbed. Black absorbs all the light, so therefore nothing is reflected. And so therefore light itself is like an infinite potential, but it can be defined then even in a prism into 7 colors, the colors of the rainbow, and of course, infinite colors. Now, why do I say all of this? Because this is a very, very, very important point. This point itself can solve every single one of our existential questions. And it goes like this. We are life, but life can then go into different colors or containers. It can go into the expression, and different souls have different kind of natural dispositions. Some people are naturally inclined towards love. So Abraham was a soul of love. And so his natural inclination was just to be loving. Now, there are other people that their nature is much more strict and disciplined. And it's not to say that that's wrong. Yitzchak was disciplined. My soul is more of a loving type. So that makes a lot of sense to me. Now, the loving type of people, they're kind of, if you want to call it a little bit like a liberal ideology, live and let live, give. It's like a little bit of lack of boundaries, a little bit like ADD. It's not, it has a beauty to it, but it's not totally beautiful. Because the flip side are the people that are very organized, very boundary. So there's a lot of goodness to that too. They're the people, in a certain sense, a mother and a father is a wonderful combination. Somebody once told me, based on Kabbalah, I don't know if it's true, that usually one of them is more the flowing type and one of them is more the rigid type. And you need both. You need somebody that's going to make sure there's supper on the table, that the kids are going to take a bath, and you need somebody that's into joy and ideas, etc. You need both types. And both types, in fact, our brain is made up of both types. Your right brain is creative, and it can encompass everyone and everything. And your left brain is very logical. Women, in fact, have double the rate of white matter. Men have about, no, I shouldn't say double, about 10 times the rate of white matter that men have. And men have more gray matter than women. And that relates to the right and the left brain. The left brain is much more kind of organized. Women have this great ability to be much more organized than men, which doesn't take any great scientist to discover. And that organization basically is delineation. Delineation has greatness to it because basically, obviously, in their mission to be mothers, you have to be very organized. The children have to go to bed at a time. So the point is that these are skills. Not to say some men are more like this and some women more like this, but generally speaking, that's the way it is. These are skill sets that complement each other. However, there's a very, very important however. What makes a human being unique, I was watching a show yesterday, very interesting show. This was a guy who was a big expert on animals. And his point of his show was, he's like, everybody asks, does my dog really love me? And he says, maybe we have to ask a different question, which is, what does my dog think about me? In other words, his point was, instead of us thinking about what do animals care about us, what do animals themselves care about? Do they care? And the point that he was making with a lot of very good research is, and the Rebbe said this, until the Rebbe said this, I didn't really kind of believe this. I thought this wasn't correct, is that animals have empathy. It's a very interesting concept. Hold on one second. Yidl's calling. Yidl, welcome. Laura, are you still on the line? Okay, very good. So animals have empathy. And so this empathy is what we would normally think of a human trait. But if animals could talk, they would speak a whole bunch. But there's something that humans have that animals don't have. And that is we have, and literally in the structure of our brain, we have a prefrontal lobe. Even a chimpanzee, which the brain structure is very, very similar. The DNA of a chimpanzee and a human is 98% similar. But it looks like 2% makes all the difference. Because the chimpanzee, ultimately, like all animals, they're based on emotions. They cannot overcome their emotions. And the very famous example of this is cows can become addicts. Cows can become addicted. If you give a cow a drug like cocaine, they'll take it till the point of death. But, and here's the but, a human being, now it's not easy. I know a guy, he's in our community. Unfortunately, they call it 1%. Only 1% of people beat a cocaine addiction. That's a very small percentage, but it is 1%. And no animal will beat a cocaine addiction. And that's the difference. The difference is that the human being, it could be very difficult for us because we have those instincts, we have those emotions. But we also, if we desire, and this is the point of the Alter Rebbe and Tanya, that's why the great people that know psychology, they say you can throw out all the psychology books. It's all a bunch, it's a load of garbage. All you need is the Tanya. And one of the points of the Tanya is that your mind can control your behavior. We're trying to help people by allowing them to indulge themselves. No, you don't help somebody by saying you can do what you want. You help somebody by saying, no, you don't do what you want in this circumstance is wrong. Don't do it. And the way to your, if you want to call it salvation and your sobriety, is by not doing it. And so kind of having the notion that the mind can control matter, our brains are powerful enough and our brains can gain control over our desires. That's the whole story of life. And again, if we think of life as a desire, right? Life is just this force. It's like a burning fire. And it's very much connected to desire. Because without desire, imagine that you had no desires. Would you be alive? I mean, what are you? So having desires is very important. It's like a fire. It's hot. But where's that desire going to go? What's it going to be focused on? That's where the mind and the heart have to begin to connect. when the Rebbe Rashab, of course, Chassidus is all about, like we mentioned, the mind controlling, and not only controlling, but influencing the desire. So unfortunately, some religions are repressive. They're saying, oh, desires are bad. A lot of them actually have this attitude. You think about Catholicism. I'm not trying to put down Catholics, etc. I'm just bringing out a point. But they're saying, oh, like the sexual instinct is bad, so the holy people don't have it. Well, actually, if not for the sexual instinct, none of us would be alive. So you can't say that it's a bad thing. You have to say that if it's used, it's like fire. Fire is bad. Well, fire does make fires. People die from fires, but without fire, we wouldn't have heat. We wouldn't live. So it's a question of how is it being used? How is it being channeled? It's not a question of the substance. It's a question of the direction of the substance. So that's a very important thing. I mean, there was a lady, a very clever lady. She went out to Boulder. She created an organization, like a spiritual movement. But basically, she spoke to the Rebbe once about kind of the sexual desire. The Rebbe gave a good example. He says it's like nuclear energy. Nuclear energy, is it good or bad? Nuclear energy is a wonderful thing. First of all, it's clean energy. It powers homes, millions of homes. It's amazing what nuclear energy does. If you use it in the wrong way, it's amazing what it can do for the bad. And so the more powerful energy is, the more it can be used for the good or for the bad. And this is the more important and the more it needs to be harnessed, because it's powerful, it's a raw energy. So therefore, it has to be harnessed in the right direction. That's why a child must be educated in the right direction. And we as a society are guilty of failing our educational system, mainly because of the radical left. They've done everything in their power to eradicate moral, and really the foundation of morality is that there's a God. Because when people believe in a God, that is one of the great kind of limiting factors on behavior, like the Rebbe says. And it's an amazing thing. There was the movie, it was written by not written, it was about this guy, Catch Me If You Can, Frank Abagnale. The guy was a genius. At a young age, he managed to figure out how to make these scams. He was making millions upon millions of dollars. He was able to memorize he pretended to be a doctor. He was able to, I mean, the guy was a genius. He was able to memorize, I don't know, with a short amount of time, and be able to pass the examination. He was able to be a lawyer. I mean, the guy was just able, he was a genius mind. So the point is, the Rebbe says, you can't tell people don't steal because maybe the police will catch you. But well, what if the kid is smarter than the police? These days you can make scams on the internet, on this and that. You have to say, because God will catch you. And that's something that nobody can run from. So the point is, and I met this kid from public school, and he said, I mean, now he's an adult. He says, when they took God out of the public school, that's when all the problems began. And so we have to reinstate a moment of silence. Those of you that want to help me work on this, we have to be very serious. We got to get into the state of Kansas. We got to bring it into all the schools here. But I want to focus on this one point, which is the point of das. Now, das is a very interesting thing, because we spoke about that the soul has 10 ways of expression. Das is a connecting point, and it connects us between our mind and our emotions. So at all times, a healthy human being will be in conflict. Anybody who's healthy is in conflict. If you're not in conflict, either you're naive or you're just like sadistic or something. A person who's healthy is always in conflict. Why? Because your emotions are selfish and your ideals are selfless. And those two things are in conflict all the time. A healthy person should have an inner drive, right? God forbid if somebody is unhealthy, maybe they even lose that. A healthy person should be passionate. And yet they should also be altruistic. And those two things are opposites. Unless somehow you're like a great tzaddik where your passion and your altruism is one, but by nature, they're different. And therefore, there should always be a tension going on in you between these two things. And part of life is the growth is the ability to kind of say, okay, I might want ice cream, but ice cream's not good for me. Or I might not want to give this much, but I'll do it anyway. So it's this constant tension. We're living in a world of tension. And tension is not a bad thing. Without tension, you don't have movement. Tension creates movement. So we need tension. Obviously, we shouldn't be too tense. Anxiety is not a good thing. But the basic idea of the conflict of the soul and the body is a wonderful thing. Because if you don't have the conflict, you don't have one of them. If you have them both, you have conflict. However, ultimately, we want to get to kind of, this is the highest level, and this is what I was learning from the Rebbe Rashab today. I'm very privileged. I'm studying from the Rebbe Rashab. Very, very, very great and holy, sublime, amazing, amazing teachings. And the Rebbe Rashab teaches like this, that there's a higher wisdom. You know, all of us exist. I don't want to make us look bad, but we actually exist in very low levels of consciousness. Our soul, the life force, really comes from God. And imagine an umbilical cord. So you have the little baby in the mother's stomach. And let's say the baby, the truth is the baby must become aware, some kind of awareness of life. Unfortunately, I don't know if you know this, but God forbid it, you know, at abortion, when they stick a needle in, the baby actually has a scream. There's an awareness, it wants to live. And so the bottom line is that the soul is like, has an umbilical cord. It goes up to heaven and it goes all the way to God. It's sourced right into God, from God down to you right here on earth. And the amount of life force, obviously God is kind of infinite. So if his infinity was here, there would be nothing but him. So the fact that there can be you're a tiny, 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 subtract tiny billions and trillions and gazillions of time amount of energy from the infinite source. So what are you already conscious of? Okay, relative to a raccoon, you have a good head. But how much more of life do you and the raccoon know? If you actually think about it, it's not that much. Raccoons are very clever animals. And so they have a certain element of consciousness, obviously not as good as you and me, but it's not like we're that far from the raccoon. Compared to God, it's like it's like a rock compared to human. It's like zero compared to infinity. So what's the point of saying this? The point is that there's another dimension which is infinite. And we have zero understanding of an infinite dimension. Not that we have some understanding. We have no understanding of an infinite dimension. But that infinite dimension is real. We now know from quantum physics that every single piece of matter, right? If, I don't know, take the nail on your pinky. So that nail is made up of atoms. Those atoms are energy, equals M, the most famous equation in the universe. How much energy? Well, that's been quantified, the exact amount of energy. Fact is, we use it in nuclear reactors or nuclear bombs. It's a quantifiable amount of energy. But that energy comes all the time from infinite potential. It comes from infinity. And it took the scientists, I've said this before, but it's an amazing thing. It took the greatest mathematical minds 20 years to discover this. Because everybody knows that it's finite and it comes in and out of existence. But the question is, what was the number it was coming from before it came into existence? And the answer is the number is infinity. You have to understand what that means. It comes from infinity. It can't come from an infinite physical being, because if it was, there'd be no space for anything finite. So it comes from an infinite potential into a minute quantity. And anything, even though compared to us, it's a tremendous amount, but compared to infinity, anything, right? $100 trillion compared to infinite money is not even like $1 compared to $100 trillion. Because the 1 to 100 trillion has a connection, And infinity to 100 trillion has no connection. The 100 trillion is like it doesn't even exist. And so the point is that the infinite potential, the infinite of God is so great that it's like, I think the best example we can give of this, and the Rebbe tells us that technology was invented to give us examples of Hashem, is very, very simple. We all know, we all come from a time that we didn't have GPSs. So today, all you do is you get into your car, you tell your phone where you want to go, and it maps out the best route. Not only does it map out the best route, it knows the traffic along the route. So if there's too much traffic, it will divert you this way, it will divert you that way. So you could have been the best person. You could have, you have taxi drivers in London. To become a taxi driver, I think they would have to study for 2 years. You'd have to memorize all the routes and all that kind of stuff. But you're never going to be as smart as a GPS, because a GPS knows right now where the traffic is. Right? You could be a great taxi driver, you know it all, but you can't know exactly that on this street there's more traffic than on that street. But the GPS does know that. So we're talking about infinity. It's constantly aware of every bit of information, not with the GPS, but with God, past, present, and future. It's knowledgeable of everything, past, present, and future, at every moment. And now you have a concept of what it means to listen to God. And if we could just get this through our little skulls, that actually obeying God is the best GPS for life. That's why I call it the God positioning system. And how does it work? It works with the concept of Aleph Beis Gimel. Aleph Beis Gimel is Aleph is a kind of Hashem has advice. He knows what's in your interest, the next best thing for you. And Beis is the actual step. So Beis is the world we live in, right? The infinity from before us is the Aleph. We live in the Beis. The Beis is for gracious creation. So we live in a universe where you have to marry your mind and your heart. That is the challenge of man, to marry your mind and your heart. And if you do that, you achieve Gimel, you achieve redemption. But you have to do the work. And it's actually a very beautiful thing, because if God just saved us, we could never feel proud of ourselves. But God says, listen, buddy, I'm going to give you the advice if you want it. But you have to marry your mind and your heart. You have to control yourself. You have to do it. And if you do it, you'll be redeemed. If you don't do it, eventually you'll figure out that it was worth doing. So that is my talk. Unfortunately, my friend has not joined me. I'm not sure what his story is. He's all the way in South Africa. So this was going to be about Moshiach. So if any of you have any questions about Moshiach, please ask, and I will be happy to answer. Any questions? Okay, that's actually a fantastic question. And just to repeat the question for our audience, if somebody couldn't hear, the question is that, whatever we're saying is a little bit abstract. It's hard. It's hard to figure out what exactly is God's direction. We've mentioned it before. Generally, there's the Torah mitzvahs. The Rebbe speaks about having a mashpia. Basically, God gives different people expertise in different realms. In the realm of spirituality, let's say a rabbi; the realm of medicine, a doctor. And he speaks about eating healthy so we don't get sick. And also in financial realm, people are gifted in business. So the Rebbe speaks about using them. Go to your friend and just listen to them. In other words, when people went to the Rebbe and they listened to the Rebbe, they didn't go to the Rebbe because he was a businessman. They went to him because he was a godly man. So he was channeling divine advice. So that advice is accessible. If you want more information, a real GPS, you get my book, Kabbalah Love. I write about it in the very beginning, in the first chapter. So it's accessible. But like you say, it is a little, not a little, it is amorphous. That it's meant to be amorphous. It's meant to be a hint, because if it was clear, like if God would write in the sky, Steve, I want you to make a right-hand turn. Okay, but that would also take away your free choice. And that's not what he's looking for. In fact, what he really is looking for is a marriage of your mind and his mind. So not only do you have to marry your mind and your heart, you have to marry his mind and your mind. But that's another subject. I don't want to get too deep into that. But I want to answer your question, which is, okay, so now it's a little amorphous. Okay, we speak about following God, it's all going to be good, but it's not so simple. Do I really know that it's God? And we're challenged. It's not so simple. When Mashiach comes, I do think the answer to your question, as you mentioned, it will be very clear. In other words, one of the beautiful things I think about being a chassid, when the Rebbe was here with us physically, is people could have that relationship. You could ask the Rebbe, should I take the operation? Should I not take the operation? Should I do this business deal? Should I not do this business deal? And as hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people did. And the Rebbe, being a divinely inspired person, he wasn't the only one. There are many Rebbes. And again, I want to caution, nobody should just run to anybody to do this. There are a lot of charlatans, and there are a lot of people, even with the title rabbi, that do not have they're not Rebbes. The Rebbes are people like a prophet. They've been established either by a former prophet, or it's been clear they've been able to say things publicly, like the Rebbe was able to predict the Six-Day War publicly. Beforehand, it will be good. There are predictions in public that came true. So it's a very, very high level. Nobody should run to seances and stuff of astrology. It's garbage. We're not meant to use that. But there are certain individuals, holy prophets, we've had them throughout our time, that really were connected, and everybody knew that they were connected, and people used them, and they were always accurate. Obviously, people are not stupid. Jewish people are very discerning, and if they were in any event they didn't work, people would have dropped them. But when Mashiach comes, I mean, I think it's obvious that it will be clear how everything is 100%. But yet, I do believe that this world was not made for us to be robust. God did not seek for us to become passive participants. He wants us to be active participants. And as such, he always makes space for our own mind. And really the great, in a way, challenge that we have. Okay, there's basically two challenges in life. One is a physical challenge. Basically, are you able to survive? And when that challenge is there, as Maslow's hierarchy speaks, and in fact, it's even an emotional challenge at times. Are you emotionally, it's very important. People need to be in emotional safety. Physical safety is not enough. People can have anxiety not only from physical deprivation or fear of deprivation, but from emotional, from being, unfortunately, a lot of people commit suicide, and sometimes one of the things that it's tracked to is bullying, because that can create a fear of people. And 80% of depression is based on anxiety. Why? Because what's depression? Depression is, I don't like my reality in a way. Why don't I like it? Well, it's painful. Well, what's painful about it? Well, one of the things that can be painful about it is the fact that a person is constantly feeling a sense of anxiety. And that anxiety, 5% of our population suffer from social anxiety. Every time they see a person, they feel like, I don't know, like you would feel a dog that's about to bite you. It's a terrible feeling. And so anyway, so the point that I'm just making is that these needs, both social and emotional, are very, very real. They're real needs that people have. But let's say somebody has those needs, or they're not afraid, they don't have anxiety over that they're going to lack those needs. So now Hashem wants us to be an active participant. And that's really the challenge of life, because it took society thousands of years to get to both emotional and physical safety. It was not a simple thing. And many people in the world today don't have emotional and physical safety. But if we are those very fortunate people, perhaps in all of human history, to have emotional and physical safety, now we have another challenge, which, like Aristotle says, do people know what to do with their free time? and people don't. And that's our challenge. Our challenge is not to waste our life. That's really our challenge, to use our time wisely. And most people fail in this challenge because they're not sufficiently motivated. They're not spiritual enough. There are certain people that are kind of innately spiritual. They get with the program. Certain people that are kind of innately driven. But most of us are not. And we basically waste time. That's the great sin. The sin of today, the sin of prosperity, is wasting time. As the Rebbe said in the very last talk that he brings from the Rama, that people have to wake up from wasting their lives. He says, "Lo yaleinu v'lo yaleinu," heaven forbid, or like God forbid, God forbid. So it's a very, very serious thing. And anyway, so why was I saying this? To bring out the point that I do believe that we are meant to be active participants. And for us to be active participants, God has to hide. If God is always going to be revealed to us, then we cease to become active participants. So I think there always will be a dimension of concealment. And life is always just this progressing. So what do we say? Life is you're marrying your mind and your heart, gaining control, and there needs to be attention. But also your mind itself has to marry God's mind, and perhaps there also has to be attention there. So I think, to answer your question, Steve, is there will always be this tension between an element of free choice and an element of concealment, an element of revelation, an element of laziness. All these things are necessary. It's like a fire. For a fire, one candle to burn, there has to be heat, there has to be a wick, there has to be fuel, and there also has to be oxygen. There has to be this thing in the air. It's called avir. Avir in Hebrew relates to the element called keser. It's the supernal, it's what we were speaking about before, kind of this GPS. Avir actually has in it the word or, light, and yud. Yud is Hashem. It's like this kind of encompassing, just like air, it encompasses us. You need it, but you can't touch it. It's not tangible. So to conclude, I believe that always we will exist in multiple dimensions. We'll exist within freedom, will exist within choice, will exist within the kind of consciousness of God. It will become more and more and more clear, but it will always be unclear enough to give us free choice. And obviously the life just progresses as it has progressed incredibly to the point that we are. I mean, Yidel, who's on the line, came from Russia, where they killed one butcher killed 26 million people, never mind what he did to everyone else. So obviously we've progressed. Thank God Russia now is a free country, relatively speaking. It allows the Jews to practice their religion, practice pro-Jewish. So we've progressed as society, as humanity. We've had unbelievable progression. And that will, of course, that is part of an infinite plan of Hashem, and that will continue. But really, if we want to live in redemption, we have to be with the program as much as possible, because, of course, the outside world, those people that are spiritual, but a lot of people, particularly the dark forces, and that it is doing everything in its power to prevent us from a Molech has a gematria of suffix, to make doubt. Oh, it's not so true. It's not so true. And if I may be so bold, I don't like putting anyone down, but many temples and even rabbis sort of say they're very into confusion and doubt, because it's a very easy escape. Because those people that are part of, again, not that they're bad, but they don't realize it, that they're serving kind of the negative. So they are very outspoken. They're shameless. And shamelessness, it creates a fear. We've said this before. The greatest challenge is overcoming the fear of shame. And so, if you can't beat them, you join them. So a lot of people do that. They just join the stupid, non-thinking. I mean, the ideologies of today are just ridiculous. I don't want to go too much down that field, but I mean, it's like the emperor's clothing. They're so ridiculous that even a child can understand that this is insanity. And yet people repeat it, and they repeat it proudly. Why? because they're afraid of being outside of that group. They're afraid of being shamed by it. So actually, they actually think that they think that way. Now, if you took them into a corner and you asked, do you actually think that that's true? They'll say it's ridiculous. But they're afraid of, just like, God forbid, the Nazis. Not every German, I'm sure, that was killing children really thought that murder was a good thing. But he didn't have the guts to stand up against his society. So we have to, realize, and this is something that I blogged yesterday, that, I think as Jews, it was always easy to be moral. Why? Because the non-Jews were so immoral and so savage. But as the non-Jews became more Jewish after 2 world wars, and they themselves rejected savagery, so now it's like, wow, they don't look like they're so savage. But now if you just look at the ideologies, what are we up against? Insanity, stupidity. So it's actually very easy to be a godly person now. One is like normalcy, get married, have children, be a good person. The other is total craziness. So it's actually become easy again to make those distinctions. But again, you have to have a lot of courage, because the Yetzer Hara, it says, is umun v'malachta. He's an expert at what he does. He knows all our weak points. He knows all our buttons. He's very good at it. And so anyway, so that's just a little answer to your question. But of course, when Mashiach comes, it will become obvious that the way of Torah, the way of Hashem, is true. And that's part of the times that we're in, that Hashem wants us to kind of grow on our own. He doesn't want it to come from outside of us. He wants it to come from inside of us, because that which comes from inside of us, it says, Isha mazras tchila yeled zachar, that when something comes from within, the choice that you make, it becomes something that's permanent, something that you chose, something that you want. Okay, so that's a little bit of an answer, a short answer to a long question, or perhaps the reverse. Any other questions?